Well, the presidency has strongly refuted recent claims made by former Jigawa State Governor Lamido regarding President Bola Tinubu's role during the annulment of the June 12, 1993 presidential election, describing them as false and revisionist. In a statement titled "Setting the Record Straight," President Tinubu's role in the June 12 struggle, issued on Sunday by the Special Advisor to the President on Information and Strategy, Bayo Ononuga. The presidency expressed concern over Lamido's comments made on Arise News, in which he accused Tinubu of supporting the annulment of Nigeria's most historic election. The statement emphasized that Lamido's remarks amounted to a blatant distortion of Nigeria's democratic history. The presidency defended Alhaja Mogaji, Tinubu's mother, noting that she never aligned with any pro-annulment group. Well, according to the presidency, Mogaji never mobilized market women to support the unjust annulment. The statement turned the spotlight on Lamido's actions during the crisis, accusing him and other Social Democratic Party leaders of failing to resist military pressure. In contrast, the presidency says that Tinubu was among those who actively challenged the annulment before, during, and after the collapse of democratic institutions in 1993. Well, in sharp contrast, Senator Bola made Tinubu firm even before General Abacha dissolved the political parties and all democratic institutions, including the National Assembly, on November 17, 1993, following his coup. Days after General Babangida addressed the Senate and announced his decision to step aside on August 27, 1993, the setting up of an interim government to replace him. Senators debated that speech. Well, joining us to give a perspective of the events of that period is Dele Alake, who at that time was editor of the Sunday edition of the Concord newspapers owned by late MKO Abiola. He is also currently Minister of Solid Minerals. Glad to have you join us on News Night.
Thank you for having me in a long time.
Yeah, long time, really. Long time. Glad to see you again.
Yeah.
Well, let me just quote, let me start this way with a quote from former Governor of Jigawa State, Lamido. "I feel entertained by Tinubu's rhetoric, the way he's dramatizing his role in Nigeria's democracy. Is Tinubu's role in Nigeria's democracy smoke without fire?"
Contrarily to his own entertainment perspective, I feel very appalled at his own submissions, which were, I would ascribe largely to selective amnesia at best, or at the very worst, an impairment of the oblongata, medulla oblongata, due to some atrophy of age, or memory loss in layman's terms. Now, Sule Lamido himself was the guilty party to the sustenance of the annulment of that June 12 election. And before I go on, let me establish the basis for my authoritative submission on this issue. Everybody knows, like you mentioned, I was the editor of Sunday Concord, which was owned by MKO Abiola, who won the election. And what most people didn't know, including Sule Lamido, was that the very first public statement of MKO Abiola to the entire world of his intention to even run for office in January of 1993, I wrote it. I wrote that statement and I advertised it in all Nigerian newspapers, all Nigerian radio stations, all Nigerian television stations. I did that. So that shows you I was in the vortex of the entire June 12 saga from beginning to till today, because the saga still goes on. So Sule Lamido did not know so many things. He was secretary of the SDP. What I must, for the sake of the younger generation, establish the parameters of the establishment of SDP and the dynamics within the party at that time. Social Democratic, don't forget that IBB established two major parties, a little to the right, a little to the left. And the National Republican Convention, NRC was to the right, SDP was to the left. Now, Sule Lamido was secretary of the SDP because prior to then, he was posturing as a leftist, as a socialist in the Nigerian political space. And everybody who is old enough or was old enough at that time knew this. Anyway, so he was SDP secretary. The late Tony Aneni was the chairman. Now, unknown to Sule Lamido, even Tinubu played a critical role in the emergence of MKO as candidate well before the election. Tinubu emerged as candidate of SDP in Jos at the Jos primaries in March. I was there. In fact, while that election...
Tinubu MKO.
Sorry, MKO, sorry. MKO. Tinubu was also there. Now, there were two factions that formed the nucleus or the caucuses of SDP. One was led by the late General Musa Yar'Adua. That was the People's Front, PF. The second was the People's Social Party, PSP. Now, the People's Front was led by Yar'Adua. The PSP was formed by the Jakondes, the late Jakondes, the Ajashins, and all of that. They were the progressive wing of the SDP. So these two caucuses coalesced to form SDP. Now, Sule Lamido, Tinubu, historically, this is a historical fact, belonged in the Yar'Adua faction, the People's Front. But on the formation of SDP, it became one party. Now, Yar'Adua still held sway within the SDP. So, at the Jos primaries in March of 1993, the groundswell of support for MKO to become the candidate was overwhelming. However, if you recall, those students of history will recall that there was a statement. This Atiku also ran on the same SDP for the presidency in 1993. Atiku has been at that game since 1993 till tomorrow. He ran as a presidential aspirant, also in Jos. Now, I wasn't just in the vortex of it. I was not just a chronicler of events. I was a deep participant observer in all the episodes that happened in June 12. So I was there. Atiku ran, the Kingibe ran, MKO ran. There was a stalemate in the first ballot. There was a tie between Kingibe and MKO. So there were horse trading and negotiations to get Atiku to drop his ambition and align with the MKO group. This same Tinubu was instrumental, was one of the principal people that led the negotiations, participated actively in the negotiations in Kantibelo's house in Jos, with Yar'Adua presiding, to persuade Atiku to drop his own aspiration and align with MKO, which eventually occurred. So when the second ballot in the Jos Stadium was on, of course, it was obvious that MKO was coasting home to victory. While that election was going on, while voting was going on in the stadium, myself, Tunji Bello, Segun Babatope, the late Chike Akabogu, we were drafting MKO's victory speech, which he read right there in the stadium. We left, MKO became candidate. Then we came to this Abuja for the convention of the to elect the executives of the party. The two caucuses, the People's Front and the PSP, locked horns here in the Sheraton Hotel. Then it was the Sheraton Hotel in 1993. And, of course, the Yar'Adua faction got the upper hand. That was how Sule Lamido became secretary of the party, and the late Tony Aneni became the chairman of the party.
All right.
And that, since then, the campaign for election began. And Tinubu threw everything he had into it. So it was patently false and a revisionism and a hagiography to say that Tinubu only became relevant in the June 12 movement after the annulment.
All right.
Not at all.
Well, quite an interesting history. Let me just also continue to bring forth what Sule Lamido said, who was a secretary then, The governor said, former governor rather, says he claims that Tinubu supported the annulment. I mean, now we're going after the election. So he supported the annulment of June 12th presidential election.
Well,
Are you
again, that was
a false claim?
Not only false. I said it's hagiography and an attempt at revisionism, and an attempt to cover his own pernicious role in supporting and trading off that critical sacred mandate given to MKO. And I will explain to you. Immediately after the announcement, in fact, don't forget that the first thing that shocked the whole nation was the suspension of results announcement on June the 16th. The election was June 12th. Results started dropping in, and everybody knew MKO was coasting home to victory. On that June 16, myself and Tunji Bello is still alive. We were with MKO in his sitting room in Ikeja, and we were reviewing events. In fact, we were asking him, because we still owed some advertisers some money, so he now asked me to go and bring the bill for him to settle. And I remember his words, I quote, he didn't want to get into the presidency with debt, so he wanted to clear. So I went, I didn't find the bills. By the time I got back, Nduka Irabo had released the statement, unsigned statement from the villa, suspending the continuation of the results. That was the first initial salvo against June 12. And on June 23rd, the final nail on the coffin was put in by the entire cancellation of that of the election. And then, of course, we plunged into the struggle. Now, Tinubu, immediately after the annulment was announced, of course, threw his hat into the ring. Don't also forget that the late Yaradua's mother or father or somebody died in Katsina. MKO, we were with him in his sitting room in Lagos. He was making arrangements to fly to Katsina to go and sympathize with. It was this same Tinubu that he was liaising with. And Luakerele is alive. If he's watching, he knows, to get air clearance for his aircraft to land in Katsina. At the same time, Babangida was flying to Katsina to also sympathize. So the airspace was restricted for any other aircraft. So by the time MKO came, sympathized with Yaradua, the announcement had been made for the total cancellation. It was this same Tinubu that MKO called. Immediately he landed in Lagos to start the preparations for the onslaught against that unjustifiable announcement. So Tinubu was from the get-go deeply involved in the struggle to actualize this mandate, and he went on it. Where was Sule Lamido?
So how come?
Wait a minute.
Okay.
When the initial wave of protests against the annulment, where was Lamido? I can tell you authoritatively, because I was part and parcel of the protest, the planning and execution. Tinubu was one of the funders and one of the organizers, one of the planners of all the protests, July 23, 24, 25 of 1993 against the annulment. This was well before Abacha. Abacha did not come until November 17th, 1993. And how Abacha also came was not behind us. We knew, and now you see the photo that's making the round when MKO went to see Abacha upon Abacha's assumption of office. You see that Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu was in that picture. MKO, Tinubu, and Abacha. Asiwaju was the one that escorted MKO to go and see Abacha to negotiate how Abacha will relinquish office and hand over back to MKO. How Tinubu came to accompany MKO was something that had been crafted the night before, and I was there. I'm a living witness. Where was Sule Lamido
Now,
when Tinubu was doing all of this?
it's interesting because then he talks about the president's mother
Yeah.
organizing market women from Lagos to show support for then head of state IBB Ibrahim.
That's a lie from the pit of hell. Alhaji Abibat Mogaji was a very prominent and important market leader in Lagos who commanded large following among the women folk and market people in Lagos. Obviously, there was no government pre-IBB that did not seek the endorsement or support of Alhaji Mogaji's large movement in Lagos at the time. Now, Alhaji Mogaji, IBB also, as a government, as a leader, sought the support of the market women. However, on the annulment of June 12, I recall vividly that Alhaji Mogaji not only begged IBB, she came to Abuja to kneel down and weep before IBB.
Okay, so that's where the coming to Abuja came in.
She
but
came
not
to
for
Abuja.
the purposes of mobilizing for IBB.
No. It was to beg IBB to reverse the annulment. And we were all witnesses anyway to when she left and came back and gave the reports. That was what happened. Now, when IBB was stepping aside, he brought in this contraption called Interim National Government, ING. Now, Tinubu and other pro-democracy, pro-June 12 activists were strenuously fighting for the restoration of that mandate. However, IBB got the Yaradua people, faction of the party, that held the executive positions of SDP via Tony Aneni, who was chairman, and Sule Lamido, the secretary, to agree to that contraption, while the Tinubu and other pro-June 12 Democrats refused and insisted on the restoration of the mandate. It was the chairman, but they were not in the executive. It was Sule Lamido and Tony Aneni, the late Aneni, that were the executive members of the party, chairman and secretary. They signed away the mandate of June 12. They agreed and they traded it off. They agreed with the interim government arrangement, which the Tinubu and other, the Papa Jashi, when he was saying that some of them were not even supporters of June 12, is a lie. That was how the Sule Lamido and co traded off that mandate. So his attempt at revisionism is actually to cover up his pernicious tracks.
So wouldn't you, he also said that Nadeko was formed to fight, claims Nadeko was formed to fight for late Abacha and not for June 12. Just hold on a bit.
Wow.
Regurgitating what he said. And then he also says that Tinubu, this one is well known. Tinubu, well, according to him, he left the country while the fight for democracy was ongoing. Tinubu didn't leave the country. The president did leave the country.
I also left at some point when our lives became endangered. We were endangered species. I also had to leave. Tinubu's house was firebombed in Musa Yar'Adua Crescent in VI. Let me tell you the genesis of that. When Abacha took over, eventually after Abacha took over, don't forget that Sule Lamido and Tony Aneni traded off the mandate, agreed with IBB for the setting up of interim government, and then Ernest Shonekan came, and we still continue the struggle against the ING, and there were living witnesses. Anyway, the ING became, we made Nigeria ungovernable for ING, and it became a hot seat for Ernest Shonekan. So I can mention some names, but I don't want to embarrass them. Some military men that we actually went to. Segun Babatope is alive. Wherever he is, you will be watching. That we went to warn that this ING will never last. That the Southwest people will never support it because they did not vote for Ernest Shonekan. And we are very principled when it comes to power. Anyway, so the ING didn't last. However, Abacha took over. Immediately Abacha, the idea for Abacha taking over was that he was coming to restore June 12. That was the idea. And I was not outside of that circle. And the president, our current president, Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, was also in the know. Myself, himself, Tunji, Dr. Abiola, we were with MKO before the taking over. We discussed all the parameters, how Abacha was to come in to restore the mandate. But unfortunately, Abacha had his own agenda. So as soon as he assumed office, he dissolved all democratic structures, right? If Tinubu was for Abacha, have you forgotten, for the purpose of the younger generation, immediately Abacha dissolved all democratic structures. It was Tinubu himself, Ame Ebute, Senator Abu Ibrahim, and another Nwite or something, I've forgotten the fourth name, that wrote a statement, issued a statement, restoring all the dissolved democratic structures. Now, have you ever seen such courage to confront a military leader? The Abacha dissolved democratic structures. These people issued a statement restoring the democratic structures. Of course, what would happen? They were hounded into detention in Alake. I, myself, Dele Alake, I was going there to Alake as a leg operative because Tinubu inside Alake was still funding us outside to sustain the protest. I am a living witness. I was running errands, going inside Alake, to give information and then take directives, come out to the people outside and all of that. If Tinubu was working for Abacha, how would he be doing that? How would he be confronting Abacha frontally, not overtly, not covertly, overtly, that he was in jail, in detention? And in fact, there was a time they issued a directive that he must be found, he must be brought in dead or alive. It was at that point he had to leave through the famous Nadeko route.
Abacha issued the directive.
That's right. The Abacha goons were all over looking for him. And I remember that.
So that was the reason
that he left.
So he didn't run away. Lamido says he
Where
left.
Was Lamido? The Lamidos of this world were hands in gloves with the Abacha regime. So they did not face any harassment because they were not even for June 12 anyway. So they were safe. But the people fighting Abacha for the restoration of that mandate were the victims of harassment and oppression. And Tinubu was the forefront of it. I just told you his house in VI was firebombed. If he was working for Abacha, will he go through all of that? I tell you, if I tell you how he even smuggled himself out of the country from Anthony in Lagos. He was holed in a clinic. If he's watching, I'm sure he will be smiling. He was holed up in a clinic to say that he was ill. When the order came that he must be brought in dead or alive. Don't forget that in a revolutionary struggle, you also have sympathizers, even within the security apparatus. So we were receiving direct, sensitive intel. And that was why he disguised and left the country. And it wasn't only him. Professor Wole Soyinka was also hounded out. Professor Bolaji Akiyemi was hounded out. General Alani Akinrade was, General Akinrade's house in Okpebi was also firebombed before he left. And they grouped in London. I was editor of the paper, of the Concord, which we were using as the media, the voice to promote the struggle. So I also came under fire intense fire.
And so you had to leave too.
And I had to leave too and join forces with Asiwaju, Professor Bolaji Akiyemi. Professor Wole Soyinka was making the rounds all over the world, giving talks against the regime at home. In fact, the NADECO meeting, the nucleus of the NADECO movement abroad in London, was the office of that NADECO was hosted by General Alani Akinrinade, one of his flats off Edgware Road. That's where we met every Tuesday. Myself, Chief John Oyegu is still alive, who was former chairman of APC. He was with us in London on exile. Professor Akinyemi, like I said, the late Commodore Dan Suleiman was also there with us. And then the late Bobonwo Sisi was there with us.
All right.
Tokunbo Afikuyomi is still alive, was there with us.
All right, Minister.
That was the nucleus of NADECO abroad. And we were being funded by Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu and General Akinrinade.
All right, before I let you go, I mean, this is on the...
Where was Sule Lamido in all of this?
This is on the June 12th. Now, we can't finish this interview without talking about your ministry, Mineral Resources. I mean, the federal government has pledged full support for the plan to build $400 million rare earth and critical minerals plant, the largest in Africa, with the potential to create 10,000 jobs nationwide in Nasarawa State. Nigerians will be interested. Is this just on paper? And how are these jobs, just briefly, in less than 2 minutes?
About 2-3 weeks ago, I did, when we were doing this second year anniversary thing and giving a report card, I mentioned that since we got into office, we've opened up that sector. It was literally dormant before we got there. Through our various reform initiatives, tackling insecurity, establishing the mine marshals that has arrested over 300 illegal operators and are prosecuting over 150 now and all of that, we've been able to create that enabling environment for investment into the sector, which was lacking before. So we are now witnessing a deluge of foreign investment. And I said in that piece that we've recorded over $800 million inflow of foreign investment, particularly based on our local value addition policy. Because I announced this policy about a year ago that we will no longer tolerate the excavation and exportation of our raw minerals abroad without local value addition, which means local processing to catalyze the local economy and create a multiplier effect for employment, technological transfer, and of course beneficiation for the local community. So all of these have really paid off. I'm really particularly very grateful to the president for giving us that institutional support and backup to get all these reforms to fruition. And in fact, it will interest you to know that based on our local value addition policy, which I went to Riyadh to propagate at the Future Minerals Conference last year, all the African ministers of minerals there gathered together. They were so excited on this policy. They adopted it, formed the African Mineral Strategy Group, and made me the chairman. I'm the current chairman of that continental body, which means,
say congrats.
Thank you. That's a year old now.
Okay,
that means that Nigeria, through the proficiency and efficacy of our policy reform initiatives, is leading Africa in the solid mineral sector. So this $400 million is just an addition, and there are more still to come. Before we sign off, I want to say one last word on Sule Lamido. All his submissions were not simply precocious. They were all tendentious, obnoxious, and pugnacious.
All right. Just to say that, well, I've been speaking with my boss when I was at TVC. It's long to have you come on Arise News and meet me again. Thank you so much, Minister, for being on Arise News.
Thank you for having me.
To add voice to my discussions with Lamido. Thank you for being here.
I challenge him to a public debate, though.
I'm sure he's listening to you.
I challenge him to a public debate.
All right.